Welcome back to the Narrative Monopoly podcast. On today's episode, we have Professor of Economics from Brown University, Glenn Loury. Glenn is a really thoughtful person and someone who I have wanted to get on the podcast from the start. He has done a ton of work over the course of his entire career, and notably over the last year on race and economics. So it makes for a really interesting discussion. I think that these types of discussions are somewhat taboo in today's landscape, but it is of my opinion that it's better to try and fail. I don't know that this was a fail, but it's better to try and fail if that may be the case than to not try at all. So I think it was a great conversation. I learned a lot from him, and I hope that you enjoy it too. Without further ado, let's press play. All right, Glenn Loury, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Jeff. It's good to be here.
Well, let's give you a little introduction here. So Glenn Loury is a distinguished professor of economics at Brown University. He was professor at Boston University, the University of Michigan, Northwestern University, and according to your Wikipedia page, the first African-American tenured professor of economics at Harvard.
That's correct.
He is the author of many books and essays, and perhaps more importantly, the host of The Glenn Show, one of my favorite podcasts, and how I've come to know your work. Did I miss anything?
No, and I like that more importantly. That would drive my colleagues crazy. I'll tell you that, but I like it.
I mean, that's where that's where I think most people know you from, and I enjoy the weekly conversations.
Thank you.
And I want to add one thing here to the intro is, and I don't know, in researching you, I don't know anyone else that's brought this up, but I think that you are one of the most clever linguists that I've encountered. I think that close listeners of the Glenn Show know exactly what I'm talking about. A lot of your rhetorical devices remind me of Yogi Berra and yogiisms. I think I think you do it on purpose too. Any comment on that?
Well, thanks. First off, that's flattering. Yogi. I never thought I would get that to that level. And I'm completely unconscious of doing this thing that you're doing. I never would have compared myself to Yogi Berra, but you're right. Some of his throwaway lines have lived on in the culture long past him himself. And I can't imagine that I'm saying anything that people will be repeating 50 years from now, but we'll see.
Well, I think I'll give a clue. Anyone that we convert today to a Glenn Show listener, or if there's loyal fans listening already, I think it's whenever you pause, there's a certain moment where like, okay, here comes a really clever way to phrase what you're about to say.
Thanks, Jeff. Thanks. People should know I'm at patreon.com/Glenn Show. 2 N's, 1 word, in case you're looking for me.
That's right. And we'll give it a proper plug at the end as well.
Thanks.
All right, Glenn. Well, I've had a few people semi-jokingly tell me that I'm about to get canceled for this conversation because I think you know what I'm talking about. I'm not sure I have to explain, but a lot of your work has been kind of outside the mainstream narratives here. But I don't really care because the subject of today's discussion, roughly speaking, is race and economics, which has been the main subject of a lot of your work. And I think the answer to this is why do I not really care? And it's because I want to solve a lot of the problems that you've worked on and problems of race and economics in society. And I don't think that we can solve them without properly talking about every possible solution. Where do you go? How do you solve these things? And I think it's right in line with the Western liberal idea of reason coming from the Enlightenment. And if there's one organizing principle of this podcast, it's truth, the pursuit of truth, intellectual honesty, and I want to have just open debates. So I'm excited to have an honest, thoughtful discussion and try to get to the bottom of some of these things, and hope that, you know, it's productive for people to listen to, and you know, it's not about being canceled or not canceled. I know my friends were saying that jokingly, but you know, you've done really serious work on this stuff. It's not the stuff of cable news hosts, and that's why I'm excited to talk to you.
Great. Yeah, race is a sticky wicket, and a person can get into trouble. That's true, especially if the person is white, like you.
Am I? I to double check that.
Well, yeah, okay. So you would appear, but you know, you never know. How do you identify it, Jeff?
Yeah, I am white. That is correct. All right, well, let's jump in. You have spoken about this difference between a development narrative and bias narrative, and in this discussion around race. And I think that that's a good launching point, because this
Yeah.
is the Narrative Monopoly podcast. What do you mean by those?
Okay, so straightforwardly, the bias narrative, these are narratives to account for racial disparity. So we can see a gap in the representation of African Americans in certain professions or in employment at a company, like in Silicon Valley or something like that. We can see an overrepresentation of African Americans amongst people who are incarcerated. So we've got a gap there. We could see a wealth disparity between households in terms of how much wealth the median household has. So we have a racial gap there. So there are these gaps, there are these disparities, these inequalities between racial groups. And there, in my mind, roughly two broad ways in which one can try to account for these disparities. That's where my bias narrative and development narrative comes from. One is a story about bias, about white supremacy, about privilege, about exclusion, about discrimination, anti-Black sentiment. There are not enough Blacks on the faculty of Brown University, many people think. And one account for why that is that the university is not sufficiently open, inclusive, and tolerant of difference in its constituting of its faculty. There are not enough kids getting into the Stuyvesant Special High School in New York City, which is an exam school that kids take tests, and if they score high enough, they get in. A class of 1,200 might only have a dozen Blacks in it, and people account for that by the bias of the test or of the school system or some combination of that. That's the bias narrative. It attributes disparity to unfairness. The development narrative, on the other hand, asks the question about the behavior, the performance, the skills, the training, the acquisition of aptitudes and capacities that represent the development of human beings. People aren't born knowing how to do calculus or, for that matter, how to play basketball at a high level. They acquire those capacities through the development that they experience over the course of their lives. And to the extent that the gaps between racial groups are a reflection of disparities between the groups in the acquisition of functioning capacities, concretely, to the extent that not enough Blacks on the faculty of Brown University is a reflection of the fact that not enough African Americans have achieved the degree of academic excellence requisite to being appointed to the faculty of Brown University, to the extent that the low number of youngsters of African American descent who are admitted to the Stuyvesant exam school in New York is a reflection of the relatively few of those who apply who have mastered the skills needed to perform well at Stuyvesant High School. To the extent that the gap is a reflection of differences in the development of functioning between the racial groups, then that's a very different account of inequality than the bias narrative. I want to stress that these two kinds of accounts are not mutually exclusive. Both can be operative, and there can be a question of emphasis. But the master narrative about race and inequality in the country, the one that's reflexively embraced by the cultural elites of our country, is a biased narrative. We talk about white supremacy. Something happens to someone like George Floyd in Minneapolis. He's killed apparently by a police officer during an arrest. And it becomes emblematic of the age old story, the defining character of American society. It becomes assimilated to lynchings, to slavery. It becomes an account of what it means to be Black, driving while Black, walking while Black, eating while Black, passing a $20 counterfeit bill while Black. It becomes about America's knee on the neck of Black America. It becomes metaphorically a symbol of an age-old account of the denigration of Black bodies, of the plundering of Black humanity, etc. That's a reflexive account that you can reliably predict will be trotted out whenever some indication of racial disparity presents itself. And what is very seldom, if ever, invoked is a question about what's going on in the background that produces situations where too many young Black men like George Floyd end up in what turn out to be deadly encounters with the police. What about the degree of violence and crime in Black communities? What about the lack of development, which creates the possibility for events such as George Floyd's demise? I'm not now trying to take a position on what happened to George Floyd. There's a court, there's a trial. We're going to have that matter resolved. But I'm saying how we talk about it, how we talk about situations like that. And there are a lot of things to say on the development side. There are a lot of things to say about family structure. There's a lot of things to say about peer groups and their values. There's a lot of things to say about the aberrant behavior of too many people that makes life in these communities difficult. And that's a very delicate, emotional move, to move from African Americans as perpetual victims of American racism to a more complex and nuanced account of racial disparities that puts some responsibility for them on the actions and the behavior of African Americans ourselves. And that's the space in which I've been trying to operate, arguing that if we want not to be in this situation 50 years from now, where we are still having roughly the same conversations, then we need to broaden the way that we talk about them and the way that we attribute responsibility for what's happening. And by the way, you're giving me a lot of time here, and I appreciate it. I don't think this is a left-right debate. I don't think I'm being a conservative for pointing out that there are behavioral issues as well as racism issues that are involved here. I think I'm being a realist. I think I'm trying to stay in touch with reality here and not be blinded by the passions of partisan conflict. I think we need solutions to problems here, education, of child rearing and family, and so on, which solutions might entail policies that a Bernie Sanders voter could be enthusiastic about. But unless we actually acknowledge problems, we'll never muster the political will to solve them. So I see the conversation that I'm trying to engage in as prior to politics, to the conventional Democrat-Republican political squabble. Prior to that, we need to be in touch with reality before we can be effective in responding to reality.
So I totally agree with that. I think that the left-right divide is actually incredibly pernicious when it comes to talking through nuanced issues like this. And there's really not a good space. And this is why I love podcasts, because there's not a space really that people are able to hash these things out. And I think podcasts are a great format where that's actually happening. I think it's fair to say, a vast majority of people just want equality, right? They just want to have everyone being afforded the same opportunities. And what you're saying with the bias versus development narrative is that there's kind of a mix between those two. It sounds like that is really kind of driving what would be in the place of equality. I do want to ask you, on the Glenn show, you were talking about the difference between economic and social freedom and the kind of resulting equality. But before we get into that, I mean, you are a trained PhD economist from MIT, and so I know that you're a math guy. So can you quantify kind of the mix of these the bias first development narrative in, I'm sure it's issue by issue, but I just started this one, Narrative Economics by Schiller, and he tries to put a lot of these narratives into mathematical terms. And so I do wonder, how much of it can you kind of tweak the dials and say, here's what we need, here's how much we need to fix on this end, on the bias end, here's how much we need to fix on the development end. Or maybe it's not systematic at all.
Well, I think you can get quite far. I think you need to narrow down the focus of what one's talking about to specific areas of economic social life, and then ask, what do the data say about those areas in terms of the relative significance of bias and development. I think of two: criminal offending and incarceration is one, wages and earnings in the labor market is another. And the criminologists and sociologists have looked carefully at data, trying to see if the existence of racism in the police behavior, in the behavior of prosecutors and courts, in the sentencing behavior of judges is disadvantageous to African Americans purely because of race and a reflection of bias in the criminal justice system. And my reading of that literature, as summarized in the report, The Causes and Consequences of High Rates of Incarceration, that the National Research Council published about 5 years ago. I was on the committee that put out that report. My reading of that literature, the quantitative investigation of the extent to which racism explains racial disparities in incarceration, is that by far the largest factor in accounting for the overrepresentation of Blacks amongst those who are imprisoned is the overrepresentation of Blacks amongst those who are committing criminal offenses, who are committing violent crimes, who are committing property crimes, who are committing sexual offenses, and so on. I'm sorry to have to report, but the narrative which says Blacks are overrepresented in prison because of racism in policing, judging, and prosecuting or sentencing is false. It's simply empirically false. I say that based on the quantitative examination of the data. That's not the claim that there exists no instances of discrimination of that sort, merely the claim that in the aggregate, when one looks at the 40% of the imprisoned population in the country are Black, and Blacks are 12% of the overall population. That's a massive disparity, and it is not much at all accounted for by racial discrimination. So if I want to think about the behaviors of people that end up with them offending against the law, that end up with them getting apprehended by the police, tried in a court of law, and sent to prison, as development, a reflection of the development of those persons, then the development narrative is a more quantitatively validated account of that disparity than is the bias narrative. Now, I can move the goalposts. I can say, well, no, I didn't just mean bias by the police. I meant bias in the fact that there was redlining and that there are racially segregated neighborhoods. I meant bias in the fact that Black education for the longest time was segregated and underfunded, and human development is different, but only because of the fact of bias. And so we can talk about bias in a much more general tone. And when I keep moving the goalposts like that, pretty soon it becomes a self-justifying account. Everything is biased because everything is determined ultimately by racial discrimination. I don't find that a particularly intellectually satisfying set of moves. It's ideologically satisfying for those who insist on seeing everything through the lens of racial domination. I want to hold African American communities, families, and individual persons responsible for some part of what they actually do or do not do in terms of developing their human potential. And that's a philosophical argument that a person could have. But again, I say I'll give two areas in which I think quantitative social science can be brought to bear in a rigorous way on questions of the relative validity of these narratives. And one was in terms of disparities in imprisonment. The other is in terms of wages. Now, this has been studied very carefully. I think of James Heckman, Heckman, the economist at the University of Chicago, Nobel laureate as it happens, an econometrician, a student of labor markets, and his colleagues. They take data on representative samples of American workers and attempt to account for the raw racial disparity in the earnings. So let me say men, 75 cents on a dollar. That's a rough, crude assessment of the racial disparity in the raw earnings of American workers, Black compared to white. 75 cents on a dollar the Black worker is earning. Varying, of course, from year to year and sample to sample, but roughly that. So that looks like a very large bias premium for white workers or disfavoring of Black workers. The Black worker only gets 75 cents on a dollar. Then they say, well, wait a minute, let me see if I can account for that disparity by looking at the characteristics that workers bring into the labor market, including their skills measured by years of education, but also measured by performance on tests of cognitive aptitude. The Armed Forces Qualification Test, AFQT, is a standard measure in this kind of empirical study. And when you control for the skills of workers as measured by their ability to express mastery over quantitative and verbal reasoning, and you then try to see what remaining disparity by race exists, the 25 cents on a dollar gap falls to under 6, 7, 8% on a dollar. It falls by 2/3, 3/4. Most of the gap, I'm saying, according to these studies, Derek Neal is another economist, NEAL, who's also at the University of Chicago, as it happened, who's produced work of this kind. The bottom line on this study is that most of the gap, the raw gap in earnings of American workers by race, Black to white, for young men, is accounted for by the differences in the skills in these populations as opposed to by racial discrimination by employers. So again, if I think of the ability of a person to exhibit command over reasoning, mathematical and verbal reasoning, as an indication of the development of that person, as opposed to simply employers discriminating by not valuing Black labor to the same extent, I've got a lot more support for the development than for the biased narrative in explaining that kind of economic gap. I would even go so far, and I'll stop, to say that the wealth disparity that is so much talked about these days. Typical white family has 10 times or 15 times the wealth of the typical Black family would be a standard formulation. That observation is taken to be an indication of the bias of American society against Blacks because, after all, those who were enslaved did not have the opportunity to accumulate wealth and so on. But I would point out that slavery is a long time ago. I would point out that most immigrant populations, I'm talking about European immigrants from the south and east of Europe who came at the end of the 19th and the early 20th century, came with next to nothing. I would point out that most families' wealth is created and accumulated through the savings of those individuals and their investments and their development, their entrepreneurship, their opening up of small business and so forth and so on. I would say that there is a substantial factor of development that's implicated in the wealth gap, as well as it being a reflection of historical bias. And I think in terms of solutions, and again, I know I'm going on for a bit here, I think in terms of solutions, recognizing the issues of development is absolutely fundamental. Because if I think of the world only in terms of bias, my correctives are largely limited to redistribution of wealth or government regulation of employment behavior or implicit bias training and other kinds of actions of this kind. But if the problem is development and I diagnose the problem as bias and direct my attention to remediation along those lines, I'll never actually confront in the case of wages, I'll never confront why it is that mastery over the skills of verbal and mathematical reasoning is as disparate as it is between the racial groups. Or in the case of prisons, I'll never confront why the frequency of violent behavior, including homicide, is so dramatically higher in African American populations, because I will have, decided to die on the hill of bias and white supremacy and anti-racism stuff, rather than take on the much tougher, messier, and uncertain grappling with the problem of development. So, anyway, did I respond to your question? Your question was, as an economist, what can we say that's relevant to these conflicts of
Yeah.
narratives? And I've tried to be concrete in responding.
I mean, you gave me two data sets with wages and incarceration, and I'm certainly outgunned on the incarceration one because I know you wrote a book about this in 2008. I would push back for the sake of debate here and give you an
Yeah.
anecdote. Outside of the academy, we're just going with a simple anecdote, which is I grew up in the suburbs of Cleveland, and I would put a lot of money on the bet that if I got caught with, buying some marijuana, that
Yeah.
my sentence or my punishment would be less than someone who grew up in East Cleveland, 15 miles from from where I grew up. I think that they would have a harsher punishment, and I would put money on that if if there was a betting market for it. And I think that that's where you know people people really push back on that.
Well, to which I would say, yeah, sure. What I don't know is how much of that is class versus how much of that is race. You'd have a better lawyer, and you'd probably get a more sympathetic hearing from a judge when the lawyer says to the judge, look, this is basically a good kid who made a stupid decision. Don't ruin his life. And if you were a hillbilly, quote unquote, from southeastern Ohio, or something like southwestern Ohio, wherever it is that JD Vance is from, and you were in the exact same factual circumstances, I don't know that the judge would be as sympathetic, and I don't know if your public defender would be up to the task of keeping you out of jail. So I don't doubt that what you say is true. What I don't know is the extent to which it is a systematic racial distinction as opposed to a distinction of class. Of course, those things are going to correlate with each other given our history. But most people are not in prison for low-level drug offenses, man. Most people are in prison because they jacked somebody's car and they put a pistol in their face, or because they came in to somebody's apartment while the person was home and kept them captive in the bedroom while they looted the place, or because they shot somebody in a dispute over the romantic intentions of whatever, or the you stepped on my shoe and I don't like it, or whatever. People who are in prison are largely in prison for pretty hardened offenses. And like I say, this is a subject that has been pretty carefully investigated. So I think I'm on pretty firm ground in terms of the statistical claim. But I don't doubt that there are anecdotes, and I don't dismiss them because they're not systematic, but that they are plentiful anecdotes. And I don't doubt that there's reason for reform. I would argue, though, that if I wanted to reform criminal justice, I wanted to do it every bit as much for the poor white kid who ends up in trouble, and there are plenty of them, than as I would for the poor black kid.
Yeah, I think it is the anecdotes do in these popular narratives, they do oftentimes overrule the data that you're bringing to the table, but it's also good to dive into them. It's interesting that you point out that it may be a class-based problem. Is that the same thing for wages? Because when you talk about the development problem, I think that two things come to mind, which is in a lot of these inner city schools, which are a lot of black kids, they can't read. They can't read at a grade level. I mean, you get to
Yeah,
fourth grade and they're already behind. And to me, that is like the sirens should be on, the warning signs are flashing. Like that is where we have to, and it's not the only problem, but that is such a crucial piece of the puzzle that if someone does not have the tools to engage in a modern economy and provide for themselves by being able to read, they're behind in math. And again, this is not all black people. It's just, a lot of
sure.
these failing schools in the inner cities. The other piece of that is, for me, I think about the context that someone has growing up and like developing, right? So if all someone knows, I mean, let's use The Wire here, right? Like if all someone knows is a life like the kids who are in The Wire, then that you can't really expect them to come out of that. And again, this is a very pointed example. This is not talking about all people in the Black community, but we're talking about this specific issue of education and development. Those are the two things, right? It's like, how do you fix the education thing? But then also, what if nobody's at home telling them, hey, you got to read?
I'm with you 100%. I agree with your statement that this should be regarded as a first order emergency for the society, that there are too many of our youngsters who are ill served in terms of the educational services provided to them. And we could talk about reform, why it doesn't happen, et cetera. There's a big debate about charter schools and all of that. I'm not against public school teachers. Some of them are, working very hard for low pay and under less than perfect conditions, and they're doing the best that they can, and they can't substitute for what parents are not doing at home and all of that. But I think the idea that we're failing these kids is clear, and that they deserve better. And it's a complicated subject, and it's a very controversial subject. I'd like to see more
Well,
innovation. Yeah, go ahead, Jeff.
why? I mean, why is it controversial? I mean, that may be a dumb question, but if the kids can't read, that shouldn't be controversial. We got to fix that problem no matter what.
Well, because the reform efforts would take power and economic traction away from the unionized public employees who are teaching in public schools around the country, and they're concerned to protect their prerogatives. So if someone says, well, not all charters are perfect, but on the whole, they're not doing too badly. Let's let a thousand flowers bloom and open things up. Education is for the kids and their parents who are taxpayers, not for the employees who provide the services. Our first order of business should be to make sure the kids are well served, not to protect the employment prerogatives of the unionized employees who serve them. That person will be regarded as politically retrograde. The National the National Education Association, and the American Federation of Teachers are powerful, large, politically active, well organized interest. And so they impede the introduction of the various innovations. And I'm not here touting anything in particular. I'm just saying if the status quo ante is unsatisfactory, allowing for some modification, competition, introduction of new ideas and so forth would seem to be the natural reflex. And I think that has been impeded by the organized interest of incumbent employees of the public school systems around the country who don't want to see that innovation take place. I'm not without sympathy for their concerns about the protection. I mean, people have a right to unionize and so on. But I think the consequences, especially for the least advantaged kids, I mean, because what happens in families that have resources, we move. If we find schools are not well serving our children, we go to a different district, pay the premium in the housing market, and acquire a decent school system for our kids. So we put them in private or parochial schools where we can do an end run around the dysfunctional public system. People who don't have those resources don't have that opportunity. So I think that that's a first order issue. And I grant you, a kid growing up in a housing project with gang members running up and down, with drug deals going on in the corridor, with everything else that's entailed there, their worldview is pretty narrow. Their sense of awareness of what's possible for themselves is not nearly as wide as that of someone who is more privileged. And you're right, it seems to me you can't really be surprised if such a kid adopts a way of life that ends up being counterproductive for their employment prospects or ends up getting them into trouble. The influences there are not altogether altogether positive. But I would note that poverty in and of itself doesn't determine these outcomes, that there are low income communities in which we see very much lower levels of violent crime and other kinds of social pathology as we see in some Black communities. So there's a cultural factor independent of the issue of poverty that I think has to be taken seriously. And when you start talking about the development narrative, as I have done, you find yourself often talking about cultural differences, and that is a very, very touchy. That feels like blaming the victim. People will say about that, and I'm not unmindful of those concerns, but I do think that the reality of the situation requires some recognition of cultural factors as well, of marital patterns, of out of wedlock childbearing, and things of this kind of what did Obama call it way back? He says the calumny or the lie that carrying a book is acting white. What do
Yeah, in
the peer groups
his
value?
speech, in the
Yeah,
'04
yeah,
speech.
yeah. So anyway,
I think the tough part about education, to come to the back to the first part of that answer, is there are so many great teachers in public
sure,
schools,
sure.
and they get conflated with the unions. And I mean, any reasonable person can agree with that the unions in practice have stunted the growth of some of these children. In that, I mean, it's when you watch. I never want to lean too much on one source, but when you watch Waiting for Superman, um,
Yeah,
it's a 90-minute documentary, so there's obviously counter arguments. But when you see the New York City schools have a special area for teachers that they cannot fire, that
yeah.
just get to sit and read the newspaper every day, you know who
What do
hates
they
that the
call it?
most?
The rubber room or something like that? It's got a name.
I
That
don't remember.
yeah. Okay. Anyway, go ahead.
But you know who hates that the most? The teachers who are great. The teachers that are in there hustling
Sure.
every day and really have a sense of ownership around their students' success. And so I don't know how that gets fixed, because at the same time it's this circular paradigm where successful teachers, the great teachers, still do rely on the union. So I don't know how that gets fixed, but I do think it's certainly something that I wish was more so in the public conscious than some of the other narratives. Um, what would you say is the most truthful bias narrative that's out there today? We've talked a lot about the development narrative. Let's make sure the listeners have a wide variety here. What's the most truthful bias narrative, and perhaps how do you fix it?
I think the impulse behind the anti-racism, I almost want to say mania movement, the How to Be an Anti-Racist. This is the book of Ibram X. Kendi that has become a bestseller. The White Fragility. This is the book of the white woman, Robin DiAngelo, that has also become a bestseller. The embrace of anti-bias training by institutions, public and private, by corporations and so on for their employees, making them aware of subtle bias. I think there's something to a concern about microaggressions, and an idea of privilege. There actually is a burden. The stigma associated with blackness is a real thing. Um, I'll give an example from my own experience. So I'm a African American. I got a PhD at MIT, and I teach economics. I can't tell you how many times I've had to confront people who doubted my competency, and I basically had to demonstrate that I was good at what I do. First Black to be tenured at Harvard University. Well, you must have been in affirmative action. It's kind of the thing that's kind of lurking in the background. Well, are you a real economist? Show me. And I have to go to the blackboard and create a blizzard of equations and graphs and so forth and so on to show that I'm a real economist, because the presumption is that I've somehow just snuck in under the cover of some kind of I've been to conferences when I'm a keynote speaker. I'll just tell you a story. So there was a meeting in Washington, D.C. It was at the National Press Club. The top floor had been rented out by the organization that was hosting the meeting, and I was the keynote speaker. I come from my hotel. It's a hot summer day. I walk the 3 blocks to the National Press Club, and I'm getting on the elevator with a guy. He happens to be white. We're both sweating profusely. We get to the top floor, and I'd step off the elevator first, and the attendant looks right past me, and the white guy who was on the elevator, and she directs him to the restroom, tells him, "Sir, I can see that you're whatever, whatever," and I'm standing there like waiting to be noticed, and she doesn't barely even look my way. And finally, I say something, and I get her attention, and she deals with me. And I wanted to say to her, "I'm the freaking keynote speaker for this thing, and you won't, you think I'm the janitor in here? What am I, a chopped liver? What, Now, I could have carried that chip on my shoulder for a long time, and I basically let it go. But it reminded me of the fact that this is not the first time or the second time or the 10th time that something like that has happened to me. I basically have learned to live with the fact that I'm Black in a world in which Blackness carries certain kind of connotations. I think that's actually a true statement about our society. What is to be done about it? I mean, we can talk about consciousness raising and all of that. My personal response is not to let that kind of thing, which happens but doesn't happen all the time and every day to me, define me, to walk around in a rage on a hair trigger waiting to be offended in this way, to let it be the principal reality of my life. But it is a reality. It's one that I've learned. I mean, these stories can be told by, the cop stops you. I got a Wall Street Journal on the front seat of my BMW 530xi. It's a nice late model car. I happen to not come to a complete stop at a stop sign. I kind of roll, slow down, and then go ahead and make the right turn. Here comes the suburban police officer who wants to pull me over and give me a citation, which is his prerogative because I did break the law. He asked me to open my trunk. He asked me, I'm in a suit. I've got a Wall Street Journal on the front seat. I'm driving a BMW, and my house is like 2 miles away in this Tony suburban community. And this guy humiliates me by forcing me to exit my vehicle and go around and open my trunk. And I'm fearful that my neighbors are going to go by and they're going to see me there with the police car and the trunk open, and they're going to think that I'm a criminal, and I'm humiliated and I'm furious. And I don't know if that would have happened to me if I were white. I somehow don't think so. And that's just another, I mean, this is not about me. I'm not trying to give a personal account. I'm saying that's got to be happening to Black people all over the place all the time. And it's a pain in the ass. It is a burden. It's a real thing. These people are not making it up. It's not the worst thing, but it's also not the best thing.
So every single personal conversation I've had with Black friends or anyone that I've talked to about this issue has said the same thing. So it's obviously a real thing that exists in society. I think that's a lot tougher because those are harder to solve. Then I mean, you just said it. You're like, I don't really know exactly what the solution is. But when you can quantify things and talk about education or public policy as a specific solution, maybe it's really just on the ground awareness. It's time. It's it is kind of crazy when you think about the arc of history and specifically the United States of America. It was basically yesterday where open discrimination existed, and the day before that, slavery. So I do think that what we have in this society is there's a lot of kind of slack in the system where you have people like me who come from a younger generation who are certainly more open-minded, and even the generation after me, where it's just going to take some time. And it also takes these conversations that we're having right now, because hopefully, someone listens to this and maybe they've heard this story, but they don't, maybe they don't believe it. Maybe like, oh, this guy's just making it up or playing the victim or something like that. And it's like, no, it's that stuff is real. You talk about, I asked you a little bit before this, but we didn't, again, the difference between economic and social equality. Is this the second piece of social equality? It's just, the day-to-day treating everyone exactly the same. Is that what you're talking about there?
Well, first of all, I just want to underscore, you say, let's give it some time. And I think there's wisdom in that. I bet you could find.
Well, let me clarify that. And that I know that, a lot of people say, oh, like you just need to wait. I'm not saying that we need to
Yeah.
wait. I'm just saying if I were to try to forecast what's happening, I think time will be a healer is what I'm saying. I'm not saying that we
Okay, that's
should wait.
fair. That's what I meant. I didn't think you were telling people to shut up and
Right.
hold their tongues. You're saying a solution to this problem may only become out of the evolution of social relations that time requires to play out fully. And I think that may be right. And I think you can probably find comparable accounts in other minority groups' experience within American society. I think of Jews, for example, in the middle of the 20th century. I love this movie, Quiz Show. This movie it's about the payola scandal in the 1950s, and it's got a Jewish character in there. John Turturro is this whiz kid guy. He's a Jewish guy, but he's a working class Jewish guy from Brooklyn who ends up being able to beat everybody on the quiz show thing. But there's this other guy, this waspy guy. I can't remember the actor's name who plays him, who is perceived as a more attractive figure for the quiz show's advertising revenues to have be the superstar. So they basically feed him the answers, and they tell Turturro that he needs to lose in order to, they make some promises to him or whatever. Long and short of it is, there's a Jewish lawyer who's a whiz kid Harvard grad who ends up working for a Senate committee, who becomes involved in the situation and who ends up being instrumental in exposing it in their Senate hearings, and the payola scandal and whatnot plays out. And what you learn from this movie is that being a Jew, even a relatively prosperous Jew with a very good education in 1954, is not the same thing as being a Jew in 2020 by a long shot. There's a lot of anti-Semitism, a lot of it, and people are aware of it, and it's in their faces all the time. And things have changed. Things have changed in that dimension. These are not the same things at all. Blacks and Jews are not the same thing. I'm not saying that. But I'm saying that the evolution of social relations can accommodate a much more, progressive kind of understanding of identity and ethnicity and whatnot. And there's no reason to expect that same process isn't at work amongst African Americans. Look at how much has changed in the last 50 years in the American political culture. African American president of the United States, Black billionaires, domination of sports and entertainment, a lot of self-reflection amongst American institutions about structural racism and systemic racism and so on and so forth. Completely different landscape today than it was a few decades ago. No reason to think that process won't continue. But I'm sorry, you asked something and I didn't respond to it. I forgot what it was.
Well, that's okay, because I think that leads me to another story, actually, which is I just read The House of Morgan by Ron Chernow, and I've mentioned this now on the podcast, so apologies to listeners. But there's a specific anecdote in there which I have not talked about, which was there were Anglophile banks that did not permit Jews to work at them for a very long time. House of Morgan was one of those. And when they were about to hire, I think it was the 60s or the 70s, they were about to hire the first Jew. And
that late?
Yeah, I think it was. Yeah. I mean,
Wow.
maybe it was the 50s, but it was certainly 60s, 70s. The thing was, there were the Jewish banks, and then there were the Protestant banks. But they went to, I think it was the chairman, he went to the biggest client, the single biggest client, and he said, "Are you going to be okay with keeping us as your bank if we hire a Jew?" And the client said, he either said that he was a Jew or their CEO was a Jew. And the banker was just completely embarrassed by the question, and that settled that matter.
That's funny.
But I think it is a good corollary to what we're talking about there.
Can I just add on something there as an economist? The existence of those successful Jewish banks before the barrier fell surely played a role in the barrier falling. In other words, the discriminated against group didn't just, in this case, didn't sit idly by and bemoan the fact of their discrimination. They got busy creating their own firms and exhibiting what could be accomplished, and in effect forced the respect of the establishment to acknowledge that these people are players and we're going to have to deal with them.
So I think, and I want to ask you about structural racism, which you just mentioned in a bit, but to kind of close this segment.
Yeah.
So it's my personal opinion that I think a lot of this stuff has to come down to, or it comes down to exposure, right? So if you are, if you never knew anyone who was black or Jewish or whatever, then I think you're more predisposed to be prejudiced. And that's just a hunch that I have. And I think that when you talk about, the Jewish banks doing it better, it kind of reminds me of, at least to tie this together, of Fresh Prince, the show. I mean, Fresh Prince is probably my favorite sitcom, 100%.
Ha,
And I
ha.
just, I wonder, from your perspective, how much did that do in similar shows in breaking down the barrier? Because I think that what that does is, okay, we may not, have any black kids at our school, but we are watching Fresh Prince, and Fresh Prince is amazing, and that kind of closes the delta between the two. So
Yeah, and you can't mention Bill Cosby anymore because of his criminal behavior, but I think of the Cosby Show in a similar light. And I don't know, I'm not an expert on cultural studies, but I can't believe that such penetration and normalization and creation of familiarity coming into people's living rooms and stuff like that doesn't but help in breaking down prejudice and leaving people to having a more tolerant attitude. So sure, I think Oprah Winfrey has been very important for race relations in America. I think Michael Jordan has been very important for race relations in America. And I think, again, he's a criminal. Bill Cosby was, in the role that he played for a quarter century or so in American popular culture, an important force. For Will Smith too, I'll give him that.
So on the Glenn Show, a frequent topic with your frequent, basically co-host John McWhorter, is
Yeah.
around critical race theory, which I think is founded in the idea of structural racism. Is that, what is the truth to that around structural racism? What comes out of that's true? What comes out of that's false? Where does that play into the equation here?
Well, I think many of the devotees of structural racism kind of analysis would say that a big part of our conversation here today has given evidence of structural racism. They would point to the kind of things, the bias, a police officer asking me to open my trunk when I'm apparently a perfectly law abiding, prosperous citizen of his community. An attendant failing to recognize that I could possibly be somebody important whom she would want to cater to when I got off of an elevator, and instead treating me like I'd come up to collect the trash or whatever. That microaggressive kind of behavior is a part of what they mean by structural racism. And I've already acknowledged that such behavior exists, and it constrains the life experience of African Americans in the country. That's a real thing. I'm not disputing that at all. People would point to the historical legacy of slavery and Jim Crow, redlining and discrimination in geography and housing and so forth, and they would attribute that to structural racism. I don't want to quibble with people about words. I recognize that those forces have indeed played themselves out in American society, and I acknowledge that. On the other hand, I feel that the way that the bludgeon of structural racism is now being used in American society is excessive. I think it has become a kind of uh, you know uh, overly generalized, generic indictment of the society. So, for example, Georgetown law. There's a recent controversy your listeners may know about. An instructor, an adjunct professor teaching a class in the law school was caught on a Zoom call that was being recorded, sharing with another adjunct professor her assessment that in her experience, the kids at the bottom of her class were disproportionately Black kids. She says, I can't remember how, I can't quote her exactly, but in effect, she says the Black kids, the ones who are really not doing well in my class, I tell you, most of the time they're Black. She said that. She said that out loud. That's going to be a prime example of structural racism for many. And I just think, I don't know what they're talking about. I mean, she probably ought not to have been casual in what she was saying. There is a question about whether or not what she was saying was true. But is Georgetown law, because a professor dared to share her observation about student performance in her class, a structurally racist institution? You haven't even begun to talk about affirmative action in legal law school admissions practices, which might also have been implicated there. You haven't said anything about the LSAT scores and whether or not they are different by students' race and whether or not they bear on how effective students are in making legal arguments and reading opinions and digesting them and so forth and so on. You've, in effect, invoked structural racism reflexively, the apparatus of structural racism reflexively, in the face of a racial disparity that implicates many complicated processes that have played together. There could well be bias in the classroom. There could well be bias in the institution, but this is Georgetown law. I can't imagine a more progressive legal institution than that. So if they're structurally racist, everything is structural racism, everything. And that's where I get off. I get off the train because they're not now making arguments about cause and effect. They're asking for sentiment. They're asking for an endorsement of a narrative, of a very particular narrative. They're asking me to ascribe everything to the bias narrative, to circle back to where we started in the first place. And everything is not, or ought not to, or everything cannot be effectively analyzed if I begin with the presumption that all racial disparities are a reflection of something that I'm calling structural racism. I feel like my pocket intellectually is being picked a little bit by the people who bandy about the structural racism charge. They're exempting themselves from the burden of getting their hands dirty by talking about institutions, by talking about history, and by talking about the broad responsibilities implicating not only, quote unquote, white institutions. Georgetown law is a white institution now, et cetera. So I'm, as a social scientist, skeptical about the evocation of structural racism as an explanation of racial disparity. Although as an African American, my experience tells me that there are features of American society that are disproportionately burdensome. But I can't, I can't look at, mass incarceration as structural racism. The war on drugs is structural racism. Police violence is structural racism. That's way too easy. It's just, it's a, excuse me, with respect, a lazy way of thinking about these problems. And you're not going to get any answers if structural racism is the only arrow in your explanatory quiver. You're not going to get to policy. You're not going to get to solutions. You're not going to get your hands dirty, I say again. It's a pose. It's a finger wagging in the face of American society, in my opinion. It's not granular enough. It's not concrete enough to be a useful analytical device, in my opinion.
Well, I think that is an answer that leaves a lot of thought. I know you have to go, so we'll leave listeners to ponder about that one after they listen to this. So thanks, Glenn, for coming on. I really appreciate it.
You're welcome, Jeff. It's been a pleasure.
And there you have it, the episode with Glenn Loury. I hope you enjoyed. I will link to all of the properties that he has, Patreon, podcast, Twitter, all that stuff in the show notes. So go check that out right now. So thank you, Glenn, for coming on. I think for this one, I'm going to do something a little bit different and say if you have any feedback, email jeff@narrativemonopoly.com. Would love to hear your thoughts. And as always, please leave a 5-star review if you have the time, and maybe share this podcast with a friend. And press subscribe if you have not subscribed yet. We have a lot of great episodes coming up, and we'll see you next week.